Today, I'll start you with a question. Do you believe in miracles? I think in our present time period, we have to be a bit skeptical of people saying they've experienced a miracle, but that's okay. I'm not talking about right now. I'm talking about the Bible days, in the days of Jesus. Do you believe that Jesus actually performed miracles? Let's look at one of my favorite stories from the life of Jesus, what we call the feeding of the multitudes or the 5,000. You probably know the story. Jesus took 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and he made that feed 5,000 men, plus more wives and children, with a lot of leftovers. This miracle is told by all 4 of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they all tell the same basic story, with a few details added or left out in each account. So let's read the story in John's account first. Let's go to John 6, verses 5 through 15. And I'm reading from the New Living Translation. It says, "After this, Jesus crossed over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A huge crowd kept following him wherever he went, because they saw his miraculous signs as he healed the sick. Then Jesus climbed a hill and sat down with his disciples around him. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. Jesus soon saw a huge crowd of people coming to look for him. Turning to Philip, he asked, 'Where can we buy bread to feed all these people?' He was testing Philip, for he already knew that he was about to do something. He knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, 'Even if we worked for months, we wouldn't have enough money to feed all these people.' And Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. 'There's a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with this huge crowd?' 'Tell everyone to sit down,' Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered about 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed them to the people. Afterward, he did the same with the fish, and they all ate as much as they wanted. After everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, 'Now gather up the leftovers so that nothing is wasted.' So they picked up the pieces, and they filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who had eaten from the 5 barley loaves. When the people saw him do this miraculous sign, they exclaimed, 'Surely he is the prophet we have been expecting.'" So I think you can understand the story. Jesus had been healing lots of people, and he was tired. He got in a boat to go across the sea, which it's really like a large lake. It's not like going across the ocean. He was going to an uncrowded place to rest. But the people were so excited about what he had been doing that they ran along the shore, and they got to the place where he was going right about the time he did, or even before, so they could see him perform more healings. So let's look at the story in the book of Matthew and see how he tells it. Let's go to Matthew 14, 15 through 21. Jesus had just heard the news that John the Baptist had been killed. He was probably sad about that, so he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed, and they followed him on foot from many towns. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. That evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already late." They had been there for hours. "Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves." But Jesus said, "That isn't necessary. You feed them." "But we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here," he said. Then he told the people to sit down on the grass, and Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up toward heaven, and he blessed them. Then, breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to the disciples, who distributed it to the people. They all ate as much as they wanted, and afterward, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. About 5,000 men were fed that day, in addition to all the women and children. So it was more than 5,000. So Jesus broke the bread into pieces, and he gave it to the 12 disciples to pass out to the people. And I think that's going to be important for something we talk about later. Here's a picture of a large crowd. I don't know exactly how many people are in this picture, but I'd say probably 10 or 15,000 at least. It's a lot of people. And I can just imagine how the disciples must have been freaking out when they thought they were going to have to feed that many people. Now, I'm going to show you something. I've got 5 loaves of bread that I baked and 2 fish. So let's see here. This is my basket. So if I was that little boy, this is actually, my loaves are probably a little bit bigger than what they would have had. But I've got I'll show you my fish first. You know, they didn't have plastic bags. They didn't have aluminum foil, so they probably just the boy probably had it wrapped in a cloth, maybe linen. And these are really 2 fish, folks. These aren't fake. I bought some fish. They got eyes, and they got a mouth and a tail. And I baked them because I thought, now what would the boy have been carrying for him to eat? It would probably have been either salted or it would have been grilled on over the fire, but it wouldn't have been raw. And so this fish I baked in the oven like they would have baked the bread. And so if I started pulling some of these pieces out of this fish, not very much comes out, and there's bones in it. It's cooked. There's not a whole lot here. So, and with 2 of them, by the way, I was going to tell you this too, just a little fun fact. They say that the fish that are in the Sea of Galilee, most of the fish there are a form of tilapia. And so these are tilapia, maybe not the exact ones Jesus had. And then we've got our 5 loaves of bread. Now, I made 2 of them barley loaves. Barley was a grain that only the poorer people ate. It wasn't for the rich. The richer, more high-class people ate wheat. But let's rip this apart. Let's say if we had this barley and we wanted to break this apart. I got 1, 2, and I mean, these are just little bites. 3, another chunk, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. This broke into 8 pieces. How many people would that feed if you had 5 loaves times 8? Y'all can do the math, right? That would be 40. So this is enough to maybe feed 40 people, not 5,000. So we know it had to be a miracle. Now, why did Jesus perform this miracle? I think I have a few ideas. First, because he had compassion on the people and he didn't want them to be hungry. He showed love for them by meeting their immediate need. Second, Jesus also wanted to show the people that he had power from God. He was showing them that he was not an ordinary man, but that he was the Son of God, the Messiah, that they had been waiting for. He held the bread up toward heaven and he prayed to God to bless it, and God did. So he divided all this through the power of God. Third, I think that Jesus wanted his disciples to have faith, to learn to have faith, to believe that whatever the circumstance, Jesus was able to accomplish what he set out to do. When I read this story, it gives me faith to know that, as said in Matthew 19:26, the Bible verse, it says, with God, all things are possible. And I think that something that they really needed to learn was that, hey, this might sound ridiculous that you could feed that many people with just a few loaves and fish, but with God, it's possible. So the fourth reason is that this seems to be a type of something that was to come. Later on, before Jesus is put to death, he sits down at a table and he has a Passover dinner with these same disciples. People call that the Last Supper. He breaks bread and they share it, and he tells them that it represents his body. And just as the 12 apostles helped give out the bread and the fish to the crowd, Jesus commissions them to spread his gospel message, to give all of us the bread of life. And the last reason, I think, is this. In Jesus' time, there was no television, no internet or Facebook, Instagram, no newspapers. The only way for anyone to get any news was for people to talk about it and pass it from neighbor to neighbor. So I think Jesus did something that was very sensational and amazing so that people would really spread it around, and the news that Jesus is the Messiah would be proclaimed. There are other sensational things that Jesus did, and they helped get the word out that Jesus was God's son and that he was proclaiming the good news of God's kingdom. Speaking of other miracles of Jesus, Did you know that he fed a large crowd of people another time? He performed the same miracle again. It is described in the books of Matthew and Mark. And let's go to the account in Mark, and it's Mark 8, verses 1 through 10. It says, about this time, another large crowd had gathered, and the people ran out of food again. Jesus called his disciples and told them, I feel sorry for these people. They have been here with me for 3 days, and they have nothing left to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will faint along the way, for some of them have come a very long distance. And his disciples replied, how are we supposed to find enough food to feed them out here in the wilderness? Now let's stop there for a second. Jesus had just performed this huge miracle to feed 5,000 people, and it didn't occur to them that he could do that again. It's hard to believe, but his disciples were still learning about him and learning how he could call on the power of God. So let's get back to the story. Jesus asked, how much bread do you have? 7 loaves, they replied. So Jesus told all the people to sit on the ground. Then he took the 7 loaves and he thanked God for them. He broke them into pieces. He gave them to his disciples, once again, who distributed the bread to the crowd. A few small fish were found too. So Jesus also blessed these and told the disciples to distribute them. And I think those fish, I've heard that they were even smaller fish, like maybe sardines. They ate as much as they wanted. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 large baskets of leftover food. There were about 4,000 men in the crowd that day, and Jesus sent them home after they had eaten. Immediately after this, he got into a boat with his disciples, and he crossed over to the region of Dalmanutha. So here's almost the same miracle again. This time, there were 4,000 men, plus women and children, and there were 7 loaves of bread and several small fish. Once again, Jesus felt compassion for the people who had been listening to him teach for 3 days and were out of food. He blessed the bread and gave it to the disciples to pass out to the crowd. Once again, they all had plenty to eat, and there were 7 baskets of leftovers. So this was another miracle that the people all over this area would hear about, so they would know and believe that Jesus was the Messiah. I read that the first group of the 5,000 were mostly from areas on the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, and they were mostly Jewish people. And that the second miracle of the 4,000 people being fed, they were more non-Jewish or Gentiles that lived on the south end of the sea, in that area. So it shows that feeding these 2 groups of people symbolized the gospel being given to Israel and to the Gentiles. And that now, after Jesus has died and is in heaven, the gospel is being spread to all nationalities of people, and we are all being spiritually fed. Some people say that the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 was not 2 miracles, but it's just describing one event. I don't know if these people actually read their Bibles, but Jesus himself gives us a great explanation to that argument. In Matthew 16, 9 and 10, it says, at this, they began to argue with each other because they hadn't brought any bread. Again, Jesus knew that they were what they were saying. So he said, you have so little faith. Why are you arguing with each other about having no bread? Don't you understand even yet? Don't you remember the 5,000 I fed with 5 loaves and the baskets of leftovers you picked up? Or the 4,000 I fed with 7 loaves and the large baskets of leftovers you picked up? So we see that Jesus himself says that he performed this miracle even at least twice. And I don't know why people argue and say that it didn't happen. I've believed in these miracles since I was a child. While I was looking up material for this lesson, I read something in several places that I found hard to believe. There are people, and many of them call themselves Christians, who do not believe that Jesus miraculously made that small amount of food feed thousands. It is hard to believe, I agree, or even explain, but that's what makes it a miracle. But these people think what happened is that Jesus taught the people to share. And so they all shared with each other the food that they had brought. And so they were all fed by the miracle of sharing. I couldn't believe what I was reading. A man who wrote that was a leader in a church. So what I've presented here in this lesson is told in 6 accounts in the Bible, and I think we'll give you a list of all those at the end. They all agree with each other. They do not say that the miracle was people learning to share. The boy that brought the 5 loaves and 2 fish shared, and whoever brought the 7 loaves and the several fish shared. But if it hadn't been for Jesus absolutely performing a miracle, that food would have fed 10 or 20 people at the most. None of the accounts of these miracles say that Jesus taught them all to share the food they brought with them. These were miracles performed by Jesus using the power of God. I don't have a hard time believing that. I asked in the beginning if you believe in miracles. I do, and I certainly hope you do too.